It is indeed a great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Christian Enemark as he presents his second public seminar for the National Security College. Prior to joining the NSC, Christian had held academic appointments at the University of New South Wales, here in Canberra, the Australian Defence Force Academy campus, as well as the University of Sydney. Christian is a prolific publisher and a leading expert in the fields of ethics, including the ethics of armed conflict, and for the purpose of today's seminar, disease, biosecurity and biological weapons. Amongst more than 30 scholarly publications, his books include Disease and Security, Natural Plagues and Biological Weapons in East Asia, published by Routledge, and most recently his edited volume, and I believe we have some sort of leaflets somewhere out the front there, his edited volume entitled Ethics and Security Aspects of Infectious Disease Control. Moreover, today's seminar entitled Biosecurity Dilemmas, Dreaded Germs, Global Health and Scientific Reform forms part of an Australian Research Council, ARC, Discovery Research grant. As our resident germ and biological weapons specialist, reinforced by the cartoon germ impersonation sitting in his office, he also has a knack for attracting students who enthusiastically embrace films such as Zombies of Mass Destruction and TV series such as Regenesis or The Walking Dead. But that's not a judgment, as I too have been known to occasionally tune in to these shows, in other words, pretty much every week, and have pondered just how far scientists might go in their experimentation with germs and, dare I say, potential biological weapons. While I can't pretend to know much more than what I've garnered from my moonlighting around the TV, I am aware, for example, that Russia's biological weapons program is believed to have continued through to at least the early 1990s. Moreover, it's believed, or perhaps better said, as alleged, that the Soviets had at one point loaded several SS-18 intercontinental ballistic missiles with the plague in order to provide any Western survivors of a nuclear war with one additional reason to perhaps, quoting from one article, envy the dead. For many, these possibilities, these potential calamities, are petrifying. But the resources, the costs, actual and potential, of naturally occurring pandemics are, when one thinks about it, no less frightening. These issues and more are the subject of Christian's talk today, so please join me in welcoming him to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that fine introduction. Thank you also to Christina Tan and her team for organising tonight's event. I'm most grateful for that. Right, thank you all very much for coming. We're here to talk about infectious diseases and we're here to talk about security. Infectious diseases are diseases caused by microorganisms, bacteria, viruses and the like, as distinct from non-infectious conditions like most cancers, obesity, tobacco-related illnesses and the like. And there are over 1,700 microorganisms that are known to cause disease in human beings, but most of those don't attract heightened political attention because their effects are mild, they are familiar to health professionals, or their geographic occurrence is limited. Now, optimism about the power of pharmaceuticals, antibiotics, vaccines, was at its height in the late 1960s, and in 1969 the US Surgeon General made a speech in which he said that the United States and other developed countries were just about ready to close the book on infectious diseases and therefore happily go on dying from non-infectious conditions. But the point was, we had infectious diseases beaten, at least in the developed world. But that was a premature prediction, because infectious diseases are on the march again. We're encountering diseases never before seen, and we're encountering familiar diseases that arise in new forms and in new places. And so perhaps we're seeing a return to business as usual in terms of the relationship between man and microbe. Certain germs are dreaded. largely because of their historical and contemporary reputation. Dreaded germs, we might say, include the bacteria that cause anthrax and plague and cholera, the viruses that cause smallpox and AIDS and influenza. And that dread, that visceral fear of infection felt individually and collectively, vitally informs the way we think about disease in security terms, with our security hat on, as it were. Because we can think about security as a state of being. I feel secure, I am secure. Or we can think about security as a practice that is manifested in the policies and activities of government. And we might say that security is not inherently good, but also security is not necessarily a dirty word. Security cuts both ways. In the name of security, many an important project has been funded, but also a great deal of money has been wasted in the name of security. In the name of security, public awareness has been raised in respect of an important issue, but also in the name of security, secrecy has been maintained. In the name of security, many a good cause has been pursued and won, but also in the name of security, many an injustice has been perpetrated. So when we think about disease and security, and we think about both the good and the bad outcomes of treating a health problem in security terms, we also need to think ethically, to think in terms of good forms of security and bad forms of security. So when it comes to linking health and security, it's rather an exotic notion. But we'll play around with the proposition tonight that a particular infectious disease threat might be deemed a security issue, not just in terms of its illness and death burden, but also in terms of the way that that disease is perceived by those who fear infection. And that fear might be exacerbated by the thought that an outbreak has been deliberately rather than naturally caused. But as I say, in the health sector, traditionally security is a somewhat exotic concept. But support for linking these two concepts, health and security, has come from both directions. In the health sector itself, there have been those who've seen the language and institutions and attitudes that go along with security as helping their cause, of raising awareness, of garnering financial resources and political effort. And the World Health Organization defined a new term in 2007 called Global Public Health Security to drum up political enthusiasm for dealing with acute infectious disease threats. But on the other side, in the security sector itself, traditionally delineated, there have been those who've looked at the potential or actual burden and threat of infectious disease outbreaks and characterised them as every bit as threatening as the threat we feel from the use of military force. And they find a place for infectious diseases on the security agenda, as it were. And the biggest security decision-making organisation in the world, the UN Security Council, of which Australia is shortly to become a member, considered HIV/AIDS as a security issue when the Council met in the year 2000. And that had the effect of very much increasing public awareness and political commitment to do something about the problem of HIV and AIDS. Now, biosecurity is a term that means many things to many different people. But tonight, biosecurity is about safeguarding states and individuals against dual threats. Dual threats, namely attacks using biological weapons and naturally occurring outbreaks of infectious disease. Now, traditionally, when a disease has been framed simply as a threat to public health, political decisions about governance and resource allocation have had to balance clinical, scientific, economic and human rights imperatives. But when you add to the mix a security imperative, that then compounds the difficulty of determining the relative importance of each of those areas of interest that I mentioned. A dilemma for our purposes tonight is a vexing predicament, requiring a choice between two or more compelling and possibly even competing courses of action, each of which could bring benefits and harms. And so in the realm of infectious diseases, a biosecurity dilemma might arise regarding whether or how to apply a security-oriented response to addressing a given infectious disease threat. Now that requires a little bit of theoretical creativity, and yet it's useful to note that in a sense there's nothing new about thinking about disease with your security hat on. For centuries, millennia, those responsible for military operations have been acutely aware of the impact, actual and potential, of disease outbreaks. From the Punic Wars to the Crimean War and beyond, infectious disease outbreaks have impacted upon the outcome of entire military campaigns around the world. Troop movements from one part of the world to another as part of imperial endeavours have seen troops bringing germs to new parts of the world and troops exposing themselves to the new germs in these new parts of the world. And one example of that, when an invading horde of Mongolian conquerors in the 14th century brought with them plague bacteria, the Black Death, for the first time, right up to the walls of an Italian colonial city in the Crimea called Kaffa in 1346. They had surrounded that city, and to try and induce an outbreak of plague inside the city walls, they catapulted over those city walls the recently deceased plague-killed bodies of Mongolian soldiers. It's an apocryphal tale that when the Italian colonists then sailed back to Venice and Genoa, they brought with them the Black Death, and that was what caused a third of the population of Europe to perish in just 4 years in the 14th century. Plague, the Black Death, would have, of course, entered Europe via a number of different routes at that time. But just as plague was devastating to that new population of Europe in the 14th century, so too it was devastating in the 16th century as against the Aztecs and Incas in the New World. Civilizations that were virtually destroyed, not by the arms and weapons of the Spanish and the Portuguese, as much as by the smallpox and the measles that the European conquerors brought with them to the New World. And that knowledge of the vulnerability of the inhabitants of the New World to European diseases was what prompted a British general in the 18th century to order one of his subordinates to gift the blankets of recently deceased European smallpox patients to local tribes of Indians in the hope of starting an outbreak of smallpox, the first recorded instance of biological warfare. And biowarfare took on industrial dimensions in the Second World War and the years prior to that in the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army, who ran a very large-scale program from the early 1930s until the end of the Second World War. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Chinese died as a result of the Imperial Japanese Army's biological warfare experiments and programs. But following the end of the Second World War, here in Australia, in 1947, recently declassified documents from the National Archives show that an up-and-coming microbiologist provided advice to the Australian Department of Defence, and in that advice he advocated the development of an Australian biological warfare program, possibly for use in Southeast Asia against Asian enemies of some kind. This up-and-coming microbiologist went on to receive 2 knighthoods, the Nobel Prize for Medicine, and he was our first Australian of the Year in 1960. He was Sir Frank McFarlane Burnett. But to give the advice that he gave in 1947, post-World War II, in the aftermath of the Imperial Japanese Army's predations, was, if you like, something that was patriotic, according to the standards of the time, and during that time there wasn't the same widespread moral objection to biological weapons than exists today. Because in 1969, the same year that the Surgeon General said that we had infectious diseases beaten, the US President Richard Nixon unilaterally renounced the offensive American biological warfare program, which set in train the beginnings of an international ban on biological weapons, the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention. And although the convention itself is rather weak in terms of international law, it vitally embodies a norm that individuals and states subscribe to this day, to say that of all the ways that you can go about killing people, deliberately infecting them is not one of them. It's not civilised, and the preamble to the convention says that bacteriological agents being used as weapons would be repugnant to the conscience of mankind. So conscience is the stuff of ethics, and that's a theme that's going to flow through my remarks tonight. And I want to examine 4 interrelated biosecurity dilemmas, ever so briefly. And in each case, the matter for judgment, using a kind of consequentialist ethics, will be whether or not the overall benefits to be derived from a security-oriented approach to disease control outweigh or outnumber the harms. So the first I'm going to talk about I'll call protect or proliferate. And this is a security dilemma in the classical sense, which arises from uncertainties that surround the offensive and defensive applications of biological weapons relevant research. So if the research being carried out by one country generates feelings of doubt and insecurity on the part of another country, that then has the potential to cause proliferation as that second country acquires a similar capability. That then leads to an overall worsening of the BW biological weapons threat. And I'll focus there on biodefense expenditure and activities, mostly on the part of the United States. Second, and we now go beyond what we might call traditional security issues, is I'll explore what might be called a securitization dilemma. And that arises from novel framings of health issues in security terms. And I'll call that dilemma secure or stifle. And it's closely related to concerns about biological weapons because it's about the challenge of governing laboratory-based infectious disease research in a way that promotes rather than hinders life-saving scientific advancements. Now, although life scientists could use their knowledge and skills for a harmful purpose, most are, of course, conscientiously committed to using their expertise for the greater good. So the question for governments, really, the governance dilemma for governments is how much biosecurity regulation is necessary to reduce the risk of biological knowledge being misused in a harmful way, like in a biological attack, and how much regulation is likely to thwart the acquisition of vital knowledge and its application for peaceful and protective life-giving purposes. And there I'll focus on US experience with biosecurity regulations and the lessons that Australia has drawn from what's been going on in America. So the third dilemma, we shift gear. And the idea is that bringing too much security to bear on a potential problem when dealing with disease can arise in respect of naturally occurring diseases as well. And I'll call this the remedy or overkill dilemma. And we could talk about this in respect of government attitudes to HIVaids, to cholera, to pandemic influenza. The idea that these naturally occurring disease outbreaks are so burdensome that governments decide to characterise them not just as public health threats, but also, and in addition, as security threats. And there's a lot of diseases that we could talk about in the context of that dilemma, but I'll restrict my remarks to the growing problem of drug-resistant tuberculosis. And finally, and most briefly, a fourth and overarching dilemma is one of attention and neglect. And the consideration is, how do you achieve protection against diseases of biological weapons concern, protection against diseases that Western countries are particularly concerned about as arising naturally, and do that without distorting, at a global level, research funding and aid priorities, such as would see a whole lot of very serious health burdens being neglected. So in a sense, it's an overall concern about whether obsessing about security might work to subordinate long-term development goals. It's a question of how best to characterise the challenge. So briefly on the dilemma of protect or proliferate, which is concerned with the biodefense efforts of individual countries, and the most conspicuous and the largest is the United States. The Biological Weapons Convention requires that all of its member states never in any circumstances develop, produce, stockpile, acquire or retain biological agents of types and in quantities that have no justification for protective or other peaceful purposes. And the dual-use dilemma of biodefense, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that so many of the capabilities, so much of the know-how for defending oneself against a biological attack can, in fairly short order, be reoriented to be used for offensive purposes. The knowledge of what makes a biological agent dangerous is good, yes, for defending against it, but also good if you're going to use it for biological attack purposes. In the weeks following the September 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, 5 Americans died after being deliberately infected with anthrax bacteria. These 2 events were almost certainly unrelated, but in combination they generated immense concern inside the United States about a biological attack with massively destructive consequences. And the response of the American government was remarkable. In 2001, they had been spending just over $500 million annually on biodefense. In 2002, the budget was $4 billion. In the coming year, the biodefense budget is $5.5 billion, and for the last 13 years, there's been a total spent $72 billion on biodefense projects involving multiple government agencies, universities, and industrial players as well. A lot of that is straightforwardly defensive. For example, the US National Institutes of Health has spent $360 million on anthrax and smallpox vaccines, which is straightforwardly defensive, if you like. But there is perhaps less than desirable levels of transparency in respect of other US biodefense activities, especially those that are characterised as for threat assessment purposes. And most worrisome are large-scale outdoor aerosolization experiments going on in the United States funded by the US Department of Defense. One outdoor testing facility in Utah and another in Maryland. Large-scale outdoor testing of simulant biological aerosols, ostensibly so as to test the protective properties of suits and perhaps medical countermeasures, but also the knowledge of how aerosols behave on a large scale outdoors is clearly of offensive relevance. And interestingly, just such experiments, when picked up by US intelligence agents in respect of Chinese activities several years ago, were described as, quote, of biological weapons concern. So this mutual suspicion must surely exist as between both the Chinese and the Americans when they see biodefense activities going on that could clearly be used if the intent was there for offensive purposes. So that mutual suspicion is then the foundation for that concern we have for horizontal proliferation of biological weapons relevant technologies. But crucially, while we're focused on horizontal proliferation, there is, in this expansion of biodefense effort, a risk also of increasing danger derived from vertical proliferation. Vertical proliferation going on in the United States itself, when it went from $500 million annually to $5.5 billion annually on biodefense. A huge expansion in the number of people, the number of laboratories engaged in biodefense research on exactly those microorganisms that the US government fears could be used in a biological attack. So recent figures indicating that more than 300 labs are handling one or more of those organisms, and there are nearly 14,000 individuals authorised to handle them. Is there any danger in having so many people having so much access to such dangerous microorganisms? Well, yes, there is. But only fairly recently has talk turned away from terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and much more seriously towards the so-called insider threat. American scientists using American microorganisms against Americans. Could it happen? Well, the FBI thinks that it happened in 2001. In July of 2008, they were about to arrest an American microbiologist named Bruce Ivans. Before they could do that, he committed suicide because he'd been under continued FBI surveillance. Bruce Ivans worked for the United States Army, had been their principal anthrax vaccine expert, had received decorations for his work. And the FBI assembled a case to say that he, and he alone, using his expertise, perpetrated the anthrax attacks of 2001. So, the United States, in its rush to defend itself against biological threats by increasing the size of its biodefense industry, is in many ways driving an increase in the extent of the insider threat because there are just so many more people involved. And with that fact in mind, we switch then to the second dilemma, which is secure or stifle. With all these folks out there, not only in the United States, but in Canada, Singapore, Britain, here in Australia, with access to microorganisms that the government regards as of bioterrorist concern, with all those people out there working away, and to, if you like, forestall the insider threat of people in white coats attacking us, there are biosecurity regulations put in place. But the crucial dilemma is, as I mentioned, how do you go about reducing the risk that your own scientists will misuse the materials they have access to and the expertise that they've built up over the years? How do you balance reducing that risk against the need to have those very scientists working away, finding out more about those microorganisms, so that by knowing more about them, we can better defend ourselves against them, be they deliberately arising or naturally arising? And it's a very difficult thing to do. The Australian government in 2007 legislated the National Health Security Act, and it assembled a special list of 22 so-called security-sensitive biological agents in a tiered arrangement, with Tier 1 agents being considered more dangerous and attracting a much more severe, strict amount of regulation, and the slightly less agents in Tier 2 not attracting as much regulation. And these mechanisms cover the safe and secure handling and possession, transfer and disposal of certain biological agents. And there is supporting regulations attached to that legislation that talk more about personnel security. And there's a recommendation, for example, that personnel reliability programs might include such things as psychological evaluations, drug and alcohol screening, credit checks, other systems of ongoing monitoring. It's already the case by law that anyone in Australia handling a Tier 1 biological agent, such as Bacillus anthracis, which causes anthrax, or Yersinia pestis that causes plague, those people have to undergo a national criminal history check conducted by the Australian Federal Police, as well as a politically motivated violence test conducted by ASIO. In addition to which, the Australian Federal Police have released a guideline to assist lab managers and indeed any lab worker to identify so-called suspicious behaviour on the part of people handling security-sensitive biological agents. And indicators of suspicious behaviour, according to the AFP, include becoming withdrawn or unwilling to socialise, desiring to work alone or outside regular working hours, interest in work outside one's own role, and, much to the mirth of many a lab scientist, a sudden change in financial status, such as coming into a lot of money. And the feedback to the AFP tended to be, well, gee whiz, most of my colleagues would qualify as suspicious because, of course, a lot of laboratory scientists are, bless them, quirky individuals whose oftentimes closest companions are microorganisms. And that to use these indicators of suspicious behaviour might in fact be counterproductive in that kind of work environment. And could it be that the existence of those regulations is a turn-off for scientists who really ought to be passionate about their work, that really want to put in the hours for, let's face it, not a lot of money, and as they weigh whether or not to start or continue a career in the research sciences, would the level of regulatory burden become just too much to bear? There's already evidence emerging out of the United States indicating that some people are getting out of research on regulated microorganisms, and also a concern more broadly that people are less likely to get into such research in the first place, whether they be established scientists or students coming into the system. All of which taking place in a context of downward pressure on funding for biomedical research. Now in the United States, although there's very heavy regulation of life scientists who work on dangerous microorganisms, there's a countervailing consideration, which is to say, yes, the government spends $5.5 billion promoting such research. The same cannot be said for Australia. There are few financial incentives at all to do research on dangerous microorganisms in this country. Maybe that's a good thing, because it reduces the insider threat. Or maybe it's a bad thing, because the overall amount of knowledge that we're acquiring and maintaining about how to defend ourselves against infectious diseases is reducing. So in our efforts to, if you like, preclude the deliberate misuse of microorganisms, are we slowly but surely making ourselves more vulnerable to infectious disease threats because our scientists as a whole know less about them? So, secure or stifle. There are certain things that the law itself cannot anticipate, let alone regulate. And so then we shift perhaps into a discussion of what life scientists themselves should be concerned about, not from a legal standpoint, but from a professional, ethical standpoint. And we drift into what's known in the trade as the dual-use dilemma in the life sciences. In classical Greek mythology, the first woman on earth was named Pandora. And Zeus gave to Pandora a beautiful box which she was not to open under any circumstances. But of course, she was curious as to something that had been given to her by the gods. She opened the box, and then, as legend has it, all evil contained therein escaped and spread all over the earth. She quickly closed the box, but before all of the contents had escaped, there was just one thing that she was able to retain inside that box, and that was the spirit of hope. And it's a tale about human curiosity, and how human curiosity has in it the seeds both of our salvation and of our destruction. And that curiosity perhaps is something that we should be very wary about inhibiting. That impulse exhibited most of all by research scientists to ask, what happens if I do this? That curiosity, that thirst for discovery has led to many a life-saving measure, many a good in society. But of course, every now and again, something bad, perhaps unanticipated, does flow from such discovery, from such curiosity. So a recent example that has, if you like, taken the scientific world by storm arose late last year and reached its crescendo earlier this year. And it concerned a couple of experiments that involved the creation of a virus that was more transmissible in its re-engineered form than it was as it existed in nature. And the virus was the H5N1 virus that causes avian influenza, the bird flu that we're still so worried about. So two groups, one in the Netherlands and one in the United States, at the end of last year submitted papers to the top-tier journals Science and Nature, reporting that they had genetically altered the H5N1 virus so that it was more transmissible between ferrets, which is the animal model for the effect of viruses on the human respiratory system. The papers themselves raised concerns at the time that these altered viruses, the mere existence of them, and the publication of how to create them could be misused so as to deliberately cause a global influenza pandemic. The concern was whipped up because bird flu currently in nature has a global average case fatality rate approaching 60%. It's not the kind of thing you might think that we want to become more transmissible than it currently is. Bird flu currently struggles to transmit between humans. So the journal editors went to an advisory board in the United States, the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, and they provided advice on whether or not to publish this so-called dual-use research. That advisory board unanimously called for the researchers to remove from their papers the materials and methods section, and that only then could it go forward for publication because, in the view of all 25 members of that body, the risks outweighed the benefits, both of the research itself and publication of the results. And so then there was this intense debate within the global scientific community and the broader public, mind you, mostly conducted in the absence of anyone having read the papers themselves because they hadn't been published, a debate about whether or not censorship was warranted in respect of this particular organism and the publication of how to create it. In January of this year, 39 of the world's leading influenza researchers, including the Australian Nobel Prize winner Peter Doherty, wrote an open letter in Nature and in Science, in which they voluntarily undertook a 60-day moratorium, and they said, we are the leaders of all the major influenza labs around the world, and we volunteer not to conduct any more research involving highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 viruses that leads to this increased transmissibility in mammals, in ferrets. Ultimately, after that moratorium provided space for debate and consideration, the decision not to publish, or the recommendation against publication, was reversed, and sure enough, the papers arrived, accessible to all of us, in May and June of this year. And it's worth pondering the risks and benefits of conducting such research and the risks and benefits of publishing it. A lot of those risks and benefits have to be considered not just on the terms of the experiment itself, but in more general terms about the precedent that any kind of judgment will set. Precedent in scientific circles, precedent in security circles. So some of the risks that were talked about in respect of this engineered bird flu virus was, well, it could escape from the lab. We could have, if you like, a human-facilitated influenza virus out there in nature. So therefore it needs to be kept extremely secure. A laboratory accident could be our undoing. Or possibly that this so-called recipe of engineering the virus could get out and be misused by someone with malicious intent. And so much of the discussion of risks that occurred earlier in this year assumed that this more transmissible virus would be as deadly as bird flu as it currently exists in nature is. But interestingly, and perhaps to the surprise of many, the two teams revealed ultimately that no ferrets died through airborne acquisition of this engineered virus. And so perhaps when risks and benefits were being weighed, that evidence as regards the lethality of the virus might have then suggested that publication and the research itself was on balance worth doing, worth publishing. The scientists themselves, when they talked about the benefits of doing the research and publishing the findings, emphasised how this was all about advance warning. If they could find out whether or not and how this influenza virus could mutate into a more transmissible form, then that knowledge was vitally important for, if you like, priming ourselves as a global population to defend against it using antivirals and vaccines. But of course, laboratory scientists aren't necessarily experts on epidemiology, let alone global justice. And so the benefit assumed, of course, that vaccines would be available to everyone, everywhere it was needed, and exactly at the time it was needed. So in terms of advance warning, what benefit is it, perhaps we might ask, to have that advance warning as a result of this experiment, when in reality there won't be enough vaccine to go around, even with advance warning, simply because there isn't the global vaccine production and distribution capacity to support it. So the real benefit has to be that governments, corporations, take this experiment as an excuse, a reason to massively upgrade global vaccine production and distribution capacity. And when you talk about that, our thoughts then drift into naturally occurring infectious diseases, a pandemic of natural occurrence, and whether or not that naturally occurring problem should be framed in security terms. Now, political claims that are made by our leaders and others about the security status of particular diseases, HIV, pandemic flu, plague, smallpox, we've all heard it. Those claims often refer, if you like, to the paramount importance of swift and aggressive responses. Swift and aggressive, after all, is so often the stuff of security. But experience in public health reflects that haste and zeal can sometimes perhaps undermine rather than assist disease control efforts. And so when one is contemplating as a government or a citizen, characterising a disease in security terms so as to raise its profile, garner more resources, increase political effort, one should be mindful of the possibility not only that such an effort will be ineffective or inappropriate, but possibly counterproductive and certainly, in some circumstances, unjust. Because it's already the case when we institute disease control measures on public health grounds alone, without any mention of national security, that disease control measures infringe upon individual rights and liberties. So, for example, quarantine, isolation, travel restrictions, all of these violate or suspend the right to freedom of movement. Other public health measures like contact tracing, notifying the government, reporting on the health status of individuals to authorities, all of this potentially suspends, curtails the right to privacy. So, wherever infectious diseases are encountered, the simultaneous pursuit of public health, security, and individual human rights observance can be mutually reinforcing, we would like to think, but there's also a possibility for tensions and conflict when you're trying to achieve all three of those things. This was talked about by scholars in this area from about the middle of last decade. And the concern mostly centred around HIV/AIDS because we saw, as a result of the UN Security Council giving the disease profile, and as a result of enormous unprecedented efforts on the part of the United States to increase funding for AIDS relief, we saw HIV/AIDS squarely and, if you like, uncontroversially characterised in security terms. What could be bad about that? It was bringing more money, more effort, more attention. But it is in the nature of HIV and the way it's transmitted, and the people who, in the first instance, are most at risk, that a whole lot of moral attitudes are brought to bear on this particular disease. Moral attitudes that perhaps could feed into an argument to say that those who harbour the virus are not so much victims as vectors, threats to the rest of us. Possibly vectors who have become dangerous by virtue of their sinful activity. So the argument might go, whether injecting drugs or having unprotected sex and the like. And the concern arose then that it's one thing to characterise HIV as a public health threat, but might we be running a bit of a danger if we also choose to characterise it as a security threat? Because that additional characterisation might be used as an excuse by less scrupulous governments to discriminate against HIV-positive people and to bring to bear against them and their bodies unjust disease control measures. So several years back, a survey of Muscovites in Russia found that 60% of respondents agreed with the proposition that HIV-positive people should be in prison. In Swaziland, a Member of Parliament proposed that HIV-positive people should be branded on the buttocks. In Indonesia, in West Papua province, one parliamentary suggested that HIV-positive people should be microchipped. And in Cambodia, just outside Phnom Penh, there is a colony, a la a leper colony, for HIV-positive people and their families. And the suggestion, my suggestion is, that the argument about security only fed into such discriminatory, ostracising practices. And it's also been the case in respect of that disease closely related to HIV/AIDS, which is tuberculosis. And the problem of drug resistance is on the march in respect of that disease, in respect of multidrug-resistant tuberculosis, where the organism is impervious to the first-line, baseline antibiotics used to treat TB, and also in respect of extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, which is impervious to even second-line, stronger, more toxic antibiotics. Several countries in Africa and in states of the former Soviet Union have witnessed senior members of the government characterising the problem of drug-resistant tuberculosis as a security problem, seemingly out of control. It's an airborne transmissible disease, and XDR-TB in particular is virtually incurable. And that characterisation has been used, in part, for some quite draconian disease control practices in those countries, mostly in respect of forced involuntary isolation of people with diagnosed extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. And then in the developed world, where the problem is not as great, it's manifested in terms of border control. In the United States in 2007, when an American citizen was trying to return to his home country, he ran the gauntlet of numerous representatives of officialdom who were trying to prevent his entry because he had been diagnosed with extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis. And after he was ultimately let in, Congress instituted a wide-ranging inquiry into whether or not there should be a no-fly list for public health patients of concern, patients of public health concern, just like there is a no-fly list for people of terrorism concern. And ultimately, an identical mechanism was put in place. The terrorism no-fly list mechanism was replicated by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the United States for the purposes of preventing entry of people who were harbouring dangerous microorganisms, as it were. And in the course of those congressional hearings, the individual in question who'd been trying to get into the country in 2007 was characterised as a threat to national security, a potential bioterrorist, a potential suicide sneezer. I'd like to finish off with the fourth and final dilemma, which is attention or neglect, which goes more fundamentally to the priorities we have for what germs we're going to research and to what countries and against what diseases we're going to allocate our aid dollars. So, as you try to protect yourself against diseases of bioterrorism or natural outbreak concern, how do you do that without distorting research funding priorities and neglecting serious, but albeit unsexy, less familiar health burdens on a global scale? And it turns mostly on the differing priorities and attitudes of Western and non-Western countries. And what we've seen is that with the fixation on SARS, pandemic flu, the possible return of smallpox, plague, anthrax, the fears and concerns of Western countries have been privileged. And the less sexy diseases, like especially diarrheal diseases like cholera, that don't attract Madonna and George Clooney and very sexy campaigns, those less familiar in the West diseases have got short shrift. And unfortunately, according to some scholars, there's evidence that the World Health Organization itself has had to, if you like, engage in a Faustian bargain with the West. The World Health Organization, desperate for attention, desperate for funding, has, if you like, played its tune according to the West's desires. And the West is overwhelmingly concerned that the germs of the developing world will somehow make their way to the developed world. But one thing that is never, or arguably unlikely to make its way from the developing world to the developed world is the conditions that exist in the developing world. Dirty water is not going to make its way to the West. Broken sewage pipes, untended for years at end, are not going to make their way to the West. Poorly funded public health systems and disease surveillance and reporting systems are not going to make their way from the developing world to the West. And so perhaps a shift is required, not just away from a conception of biosecurity that is state-centric and which privileges Western interests, but also a shift, at least in part, towards a notion of biosecurity that is somewhat less germ-centric, as it were. There are those who argue for rhetorical purposes that particular diseases are not caused by germs. Many scientists would disagree, and the germ theory that emerged at the end of the 19th century is now the germ law. Infectious diseases really are caused by infectious microorganisms. So it was rhetorically irresponsible and overblown, for example, when the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, said, AIDS is not caused by HIV, it's caused by poverty. Well, no, AIDS is caused by HIV, and yet there was a grain of truth in what he was saying, in as much as progression from mere HIV infection to full-blown AIDS can be forestalled with access to antiretroviral drugs, which can be expensive and which are much more affordable and available in the West than in the developing world. So in a sense, he was right. We wouldn't want to give that kind of argument too much air, but it speaks to a concern to move a little bit away from a germ-by-germ approach. Eradicate the germ, you eradicate the disease mentality, and more towards an approach that is concerned with living conditions, to environmental circumstances. Once upon a time, before the germ theory became triumphant, there were theories of disease that were concerned with miasmas and evil influences. Well, perhaps something along those lines is necessary once again, so that instead of fixating on eradicating individual germs, we turn away from that approach and more towards a development approach. Because germ by germ, disease by disease, is much more comprehensible to a security mindset. And yet a concern for conditions, for environmental circumstances, is perhaps best addressed, if you like, with your development hat on. So as the threat of infectious diseases is something that looms up, threat expands, becomes more varied, as we contemplate naturally occurring disease outbreaks, as well as the awful prospect of being attacked with microorganisms. To what extent, if at all, does the solution lie in this thing called security?
Thanks, Christian, for a very thought-provoking discussion of 4 interdependent themes. And I might just, at this point, open the floor to questions. I believe we've got 25 minutes. If you could just provide your name, background, and just, straight to the point with the question, that'd be greatly appreciated, so we can get as many questions in. So, thank you.
Ian Ramshaw, one of those lonely scientists that like bacteria. Basically, I just want to make a point more than anything about Sir Macfarlane Burnet. You brought him in a little bit disregard, but he was a highly ethical individual. And you brought up the subject of influenza. And Sir Macfarlane Burnet actually was a virologist and worked with influenza. And he gave up that work for ethical reasons. He was afraid to create a virus that started a pandemic in his laboratory. So he stopped work on that influenza, in that influenza area, specifically for that. Just to bring that to the point.
I didn't know that. Thank you very much for raising it.
Christian Cameron James, thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed it. As a member of the Defence Force, I've recently been in positions for biological security and defence. What advancements do you know of biological defence in order to create the step forward to get in front of the bell curve, if you will, in defending these agents? Because the only way I seem to know is people presenting at hospitals that are ill. What are your thoughts on that, please?
I think in this realm, as in so many others, defence will always lag behind offence. The number of permutations of biological attack is theoretically high, and I think even in the United States the mood has shifted away from trying to come up with countermeasures that defend against each and every possibility in that sense, and sort of be ahead of the game in that sense, and more towards general preparedness and resilience. An attitude that the better able we are to get through it after it's happened is the best way forward, because trying to preempt every conceivable possibility is extremely difficult. It's also potentially a dangerous thing to do when you're trying to imagine and preempt novel biological threats. and then think about ways to defend against those threats, which might entail simply creating a new kind of organism just to test whether or not you can defend yourself against it. That kind of overly proactive approach, perhaps, does carry dangers. So I guess my answer to your question is that getting ahead of the curve is not a prospect that I think is likely, or a course of action that I would think is advisable.
I enjoyed your talk. I think you address very important issues, especially a lot of ethical issues. We often neglect, especially when we talk about science, and as if it was only facts there. But I think this is a very important issue you address. But how can we, or you, persuade politicians to adopt your approach? Because I think it's very important, especially your approach of developing. I think it is very important. But how can we persuade politicians to come to board?
Yes, many an academic lies awake at night thinking just such thoughts. Well, politicians, especially in the security space, are seldom punished for overestimating risks, but often punished for having found, in retrospect, to have underestimated them. So I think in the security sector especially, there is a tendency to deal in worst cases and to devote attention and resources for dealing with what we might call the worst end of the spectrum. And perhaps only in hindsight are we able to find that it was wasteful and ill-conceived to do so. But by the same token, those who operate in that sector do feel a responsibility that, well, someone has to cover off the worst case end of the scenario. And I guess so long as there's an awareness that other things have to go by the board, part of shifting, or at least not entirely, but at least in part, away from a germ-by-germ approach and more to a general public health preparedness system resilience approach, is that by building up your public health capacity, your disease surveillance reporting capacity, your response capacity at a population level, you're making yourself less vulnerable to a biological attack, but you're also doing those things and spending that money for the additional and much greater purpose of just raising health standards across the board. So there's a sense in which if politicians can be made to see that there is a dual benefit, both for public health and national security purposes, in increasing baseline capacity, then that might be an argument worth making. But I'd also respond to your question by saying, let's not put too much pressure on the politicians, as you put it. A lot of citizens, especially in this town, revert to the thought that if there's a problem, then the government ought to do something about it. In respect of my second dilemma, secure or stifle, I'm actually of the view that we probably shouldn't be asking politicians to do any more than they currently are, because they can't. Political leaders, legislators, the law cannot anticipate the unanticipated outcomes of some life science research. The onus perhaps lies not so much with legislators to protect us, but rather with the life science profession itself, to engage in voluntary self-governance, to come up with internal codes of consultation and codes of ethics, codes of conduct, consulting as amongst themselves, debating as amongst themselves. What are the risks and benefits of engaging in a particular line of research? What are the risks and benefits of publishing particular research findings? And if the profession doesn't want to do that, no amount of legislation and regulating will make it happen. So instead of calling on the politicians, perhaps, without wanting to name names, but I will, we should call upon the Australian Academy of Sciences to take the lead on that issue.
Dallas Stowe from the Defence Science and Technology Organisation. On that line then, do you have a view on the Defence Exports Control Bill currently before Parliament?
I was hoping no one would ask me a question about that, Dallas. I commend you on your currency. Well, Ian Chubb tried to reassure us in today's Australian that a committee of sorts would be created to work as a circuit breaker on perverse decision-making within government. To dodge the ball, I'd have to say that the bill hasn't gone through, let alone have there been debates on the amendments to moderate its terms. Would you, in a private capacity, like to offer an opinion?
It's an interesting dilemma that the government faces, in that there's been severe criticism within the academic sphere, of course. There's also been the Greens opposition, and the statement that Senator Ludlam made, particularly strong, saying that the amendments hadn't even got a look in, and no debate and no scrutiny within the Senate committee. So, if I were in the government, I'd be playing it very, very slowly, because if we're talking about risk averse, we're likely to put ourselves on the horns of a dilemma and toss ourselves into the bull ring. There's a couple of and so I'd be playing it very slowly to bring that in. The difficulty is, as has been brought out by the Deputy Vice-Chancellor from the University of New South Wales, Jill Cohellan, is that you've said that scientists are very quirky people. My God, yes, spot on. And the difficulty is, sorry about that, any biologist or...
Quirky in a very good and charming way.
Yes, that's right. The difficulty is that if they don't want to do it, they don't see a benefit in it, and it's not easy to do, they'll work around it, because they're very, very smart people, and they're very, very good at doing that. So it's got to be a system which is attractive to them, and that they're not going to say, well, bugger this, I'm just going to subvert it. I don't care what the risks are. I don't think I'm going to be caught. I'll just go ahead and do it anyway. It's got to be one where they say, well, I've got to do this because it's in everybody's interest to do it. And until that system, until that's actually built into the methodology, and I'm sure Ian Chubb knows that, is that it's not going to be a viable... If it becomes an act, it'll have holes and it'll be not viable. That's my opinion.
Okay, well, look, I thank you for that, and I exhort all of you to follow the progress of that bill through Parliament and see what comes out at the other end. Thank you very much for that.
Hi, my name is Chin Chin. I'm a physics undergraduate. So, in light of the recent news that some Italian scientists are charged for the earthquake incident, do you see how we can relate this to biosecurity? Like, are we nearing an age whereby scientists can be blamed for not preparing enough?
Yes, I think that decision sent a shiver through the spine of many a government scientist. And I talked earlier on about people being punished for having underestimated risk. Well, that's a pretty stark example of that. I think, you see, I don't understand the way that earthquakes work, but perhaps risk assessment is different, or at least maybe slightly easier in that realm than is the case in the life sciences, not least because there are second or third order consequences that can flow from particular experiment results that cannot reasonably be anticipated, let alone risk assessed. The biosecurity regulations that are about reducing the risk of accidents and misuse of microorganisms in the United States, those regulations have bitten and at least one scientist I know of has been imprisoned for breaching biosecurity regulations. There was an expert on plague bacteria by the name of Thomas Butler. He was in prison for 2 years. He'd been charged with a whole number of things, some of them fraud-related, but for our purposes, biosecurity-related in respect of incorrect, unauthorised handling and transport of plague bacteria. And after he was sentenced, the leading officials in the American National Academies of Science wrote to the then Attorney General of the United States and said words to the effect of, "Bravo, you've just shot yourself in the foot. You've just managed to lock up for 2 years exactly the kind of scientist who can best defend this country against the plague." And that neatly encapsulated the way in which biosecurity regulation has a dilemma of whether and when to characterise a scientist as a villain or a saviour. So we'll see if and when an Australian scientist comes a cropper of the Australian laws. No one yet has done that.
Hi, I'm Judith Avery. I was just wondering if someone ever speaks up for the animals, like all the ferrets.
Yes, I think any experiment that involves the use of animal subjects is, certainly in this country and in most countries in the world, goes through an animal ethics committee, animal research ethics. There are prohibitions on using obscenely large numbers of animals in your method. In a once controversial experiment conducted here in Canberra, involving the mousepox virus, I read that no more than 30 mice died in the course of that experiment. I don't know how many ferrets died in the course of those H5N1 avian influenza experiments, but animal ethics committees will insist that the minimum number of animals be destroyed in the course of such experiments, and they may well go back to the researchers and say, you're going to have to change your methodology if you think you need to use this many. So be assured on that front, at least partly reassured.
Thank you. My name's Philip, and I found interesting your terminology of to securitise or not to securitise as a threat. I was reading recently an article out of Bangladesh about securitising climate change in the area, and obviously it seems we're securitising a lot of issues today, and there are some very smart people whose job it is to securitise problems and look at problems in terms of security, obviously some of which are in this room at the moment. To what extent do you think it's inevitable that problems such as these are looked at in terms of security? And do you think that trying to look at alternatives to securitising is possibly difficult?
A good question. And incidentally, I certainly hope that no one thinks that it is the job of the National Security College to securitise willy-nilly. Although the founder of the college, our former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, was an avid securitiser, as reflected in his first National Security Statement of 2008. At least 16 individual threats were on the Rudd security agenda. And a lot of people were delighted by that, and other people were just flabbergasted. And certainly there's a debate to be had about whether or not climate change can plausibly be characterised as a security issue. I think as academics in the security studies realm, it's our responsibility to inquire into all the nuances of securitisation. That securitisation is not a monolithic concept. that we ask questions such as whose security? Securitisation for what purpose? Security being achieved over what time period? Security being achieved at what cost? Security being achieved at what cost to other interests? All of which means that a debate can be had about the plausibility of framing something as a security issue and the desirability of framing something as a security issue. And it may be that in some circumstances the only way to make a stingy government reach for their hip pocket, as they so often do in respect of joint strike fighters and submarines and what have you, is to frame the issue in security terms. But I don't think that that can be done easily, and I certainly don't think it is inevitable, because if too many issues turn up on the security agenda, then the danger is that governments and citizens will get security fatigue. And the ability of securitisation to garner resources and to heighten political attention will only diminish. And then we'll be left with an old security agenda that amounts to nothing more nor less than the use of force, which I think is definitely inadequate. But how inadequate is a subject for debate.
Hello, my name's Hayley. I just have a very quick question. You talked about how, scientists working on different, germs and microbes can, be a threat, a security threat. And I'm wondering how easy / difficult is it for non-state actors to create these types of, threats to populations? Because I know that it's been used, by terrorist groups in the past. I'm wondering how easy it is. Should we be worried?
Well, of course, the term non-state actor can be applied to a great many. It could be an individual, as you suggested first. It could be a group that's been described as a terrorist group that appears on a published official list of terrorist groups. It could be a hypothetical terrorist, if you like, who does something, and then because of that act, we then subsequently call them a terrorist. A non-state actor could be a corporation, a private military company, all sorts of permutations there. But I'll home in on the term you used, which was terrorist group. And there are people with security clearances who do eavesdropping and other intelligence gathering that would have a better handle on this than I. But based on what's available in the public record and knowledge of the requirements for carrying out a biological attack that is in fact massively destructive, the likelihood of one of the groups that appears on a list of terrorist groups being able to succeed is extremely low. Not least because perhaps the intention to go down that road might not be there in the first place, but they're doing very nicely with conventional explosives, thank you very much. And also because to change your modus operandi could be a real opportunity cost for such groups, and you could put in a whole lot of effort and arrive with an absolute dud as you try to use microorganisms deliberately. The only terrorist group that I know of that came even halfway close was an apocalyptic cult in Japan called the Om Shinrikyo, the Om Supreme Truth cult. They're well known for having gassed the Tokyo subway with a chemical agent called sarin in 1995, but before they did that, they tried to use Clostridium botulinum bacteria to produce botulinum toxin, which is pretty much the most toxic substance on Earth. And they tried to use Bacillus anthracis to carry out an anthrax-based attack. And Aum Shinrikyo, bless their socks, had millions of dollars at their disposal, tens of thousands of members, and amongst their membership were trained microbiologists and engineers and physicists and other bods that you would perhaps need to carry out a successful biological attack. One of their microbiologists within the organisation was referred to as the Minister for Health and Welfare, but I digress. It was also the case that perhaps a terrorist organisation is not the calmest, quietest, concentration-conducive environment in which to go about growing organisms and figuring out how to disseminate them. And Aum Shinrikyo cult members were regularly forced to ingest LSD. They would undergo ritual beatings. The guru of the cult was quite changeable and unpredictable. And this was not really a good environment to be working in. But it's interesting to note that case because Aum Shinrikyo operated for years in this vein with very little attention from the Japanese government because the cult had special religious status under Japanese law. And it was only after the sarin attacks that the Japanese government found out about what the cult had been up to on the biological front. But on a number of fronts, they simply screwed up. They weren't able to isolate toxin from their Clostridium botulinum bacteria, and they used a strain of anthrax bacteria that wasn't deadly to humans. There's a whole lot of fundamental errors being made, which is not to say that other groups will make those errors. But let's just say that if you're going to carry out a serious biological attack, you'd better have the resources of a wealthy state behind you. Well, in a sense, if Bruce Ivans was responsible, in a sense, he had the resources of the United States government behind him. In the sense, not deliberately, but sort of inadvertently. He was a senior microbiologist working for the United States Army for 30 years. He was their anthrax man. And because of his position, and because of what US government policy and activity was, if you like, that was inadvertent, unwitting state sponsorship of an insider attack. You could characterise it that way.
I think we've reached the time, so I'd just like to once again thank Christian for a very interesting talk, one that has covered a number of very interesting issues, I think not only for specialists, but for those just members of the public, for people such as myself as well. The issue of certain ethical boundaries, the issue of securitisation, of course, from biological weapons to also diseases linking into all of this. Importantly, as is always the case with Dr. Enemark's presentations, a very nuanced and well thought out analysis. So if you might all like to join me in once again thanking Dr. Enemark for a wonderful presentation.